Welcome. You are listening to an interview with Professor Susan Parnell, Global Challenges Research Professor at the University of Bristol and President of the SNIS Scientific Committee. As Susan is originally from South Africa and has confessed to an eclectic music taste, I got the freedom to choose what song to feature for our interview, and I went for Miriam Makeba, the renowned anti-apartheid singer, to lead us into the first question. So, Susan, what is your take on your first couple of years of membership and presidency of the SNIS Scientific Committee?
So part of what is really rewarding for me is that it is both a very diverse group of people in the sense of where they come from, literally, physically, geographically, where they come from. And I think that's quite important because one of the objectives of SNIS is to have a global focus. So I think having people who work on different parts of the world, who have partners in different parts of the world, but are themselves based in different parts of the world. So I like that. And I like the fact that there's a good European representation on the committee. And I like the fact that everybody who's there is both a respected scholar in their own right, but has also worked on research funding bodies. Because I think you learn different skills from when you're applying for funds and when you are adjudicating who should come in. And so you get different kinds of wisdom that come through, and that I appreciate, as well as different personalities, of course, very different kinds of people. And I find that rewarding. And I think that sets apart the deliberation process. Also, it's a two-part process, that there's a preliminary process. We ask for changes and give candidates the opportunity to revise their submissions. And so we can come back to things. And that's really exciting because you do see the maturing of an idea, the maturing of a team, the ability to, whoops, we left that out. But it does mean that for the panel, you don't feel like you're talking to a black hole. There's a real sense of dialogue. Yeah.
Could you give us some highlights from your personal life that have impacted you as a researcher?
I think life gets in the way of one's professional profile, right? And I'm sure I'm not the only person who would say that. I think where you are at critical moments of your career is really important. And I was a graduate student and an early career researcher in the end of apartheid and in the immediate aftermath. And so that was absolutely formative. It was almost, there was nothing else one could or should work on. And I was very happy to do that. And it really was formative. And my generation was both in apartheid and in the reconstruction from apartheid. So I think that it saw a shift for me from doing mainly historical work of what was wrong and how did we get into the mess to, okay, how do we begin to build an alternative? Methodologically, it was very different because I moved from the archive, really basically doing historical work, into doing really strongly policy-facing work. And then I suppose there was another big shift for me, which was about 6 or 7 years ago, partly because I was doing a lot of global work and I was getting exhausted from traveling so much. I moved to the UK and have been much more able to engage in kind of what I suppose you might call it multilateralism, international work, global focused work. So for me, there's a social element and a locational element, if you like, that have shaped me.
You are a researcher of a certain amount of experience. How would you describe the current research landscape?
The research landscape has changed exponentially. And I think part of that is that it's much more difficult to be a lone researcher now than it ever was. I do worry a little bit that we've made it harder and harder for lone researchers. The way that money flows makes that very difficult. And you see sometimes some of the projects that we get, I think, are very good at embedding individual scholars in a bigger project. And I think that's very helpful because quite often some of the very best work, some of the best minds are involved in projects that they're quite obsessed with and that require support. So that I think has become more difficult, and that's a negative, I would say. But there are lots of positives. We've become much more open to the idea that the science policy interface is a two-way process, that knowledge lies in lots of different places, that we can invoke it, and that because we now know a lot about a lot of things, some of the innovation comes from synthesis, and that is credible new knowledge. And that applies across a lot of our fields. And certainly when we begin to talk to each other and we begin to get synergistic knowledge that draws from different disciplines and genuinely uses it to create new knowledge, that catalyst, I think, is new and newly recognized. And that's great. And then I suppose the third thing I think is amazing about the new research order, there is a recognition that you have to focus on the global south. The changes that are taking place in our world are predominantly there. If you're interested in being at the frontier, then that's where the wave is crashing. Best you find out what's happening there.
All this being said, what is a good SNIS project in your opinion? A project that makes you think, aha, this should get funded.
So one of the things which is, for me, always helpful is the research question clear. And that's actually quite difficult to do when you have a group. It's much easier when you're a lone researcher to have a very clear research question. And so if you can start off by having a really clear research question, but then your research design demonstrates how the component parts of the project, because in a large project, there are always component parts, okay? That's how we put these projects together. But do the Lego blocks make up something that is greater than the individual Lego block components? And quite often what you'll see is little components that are actually all quite interesting, but the overarching research question is not clear. And the way that the component parts relate back to the core question is not clear. And then you certainly see that in the methods, because typically what happens is that different elements of the projects have slightly different methods or methodological components. But the question of how you bring all of these things together at the other end to say, so what? What difference is this going to make? Who's that going to interact with? That doesn't always get defined very well. And then finally, I think the really crucial thing is it's a bit like casting in a play. Are the people who are involved in the project the right people? And do they have the right size role? So it's that coherence and clarity that for me marks out a really distinguished application.
Any other thing you would like to share with our listeners, something I didn't think of asking or that you hold in particular to be said?
I think for me, one of the things which sets this apart is that the Secretariat is fundamentally involved in every element of the project. So from the call to the way that the software is set up for the committee to review projects, to administering the projects, to receiving those things. And that's an intellectual task. It's not an administrative task. And the stability and the backroom support, the underlying architecture, I think, of the program for me is what makes it as effective as it is. And I think there's probably a whole set of kind of career trajectories. We talked about kind of new ways of funding research, but I think understanding the role that the so-called support team play in the delivery and then the final kind of distribution, if you like, of research money is something that we need to recognize. So yeah, perhaps just pay some credit to that and to remind researchers to engage as much with the SNIS central office as they do with the document that they're preparing, because there's an awful lot of effort that goes into that.
Susan Parnell, thank you so much for this. We leave our listeners to meditate on your words in the echoes of Miriam Makeba's most famous hit, Pata Pata.